I thank you, Madam Speaker. I do want to, first of all, note that this bill does actually not only propose on how we can have an effective legal tool to promote businesses and cure late payments in county government, but also in national government. And that means that with regards to goods, services, and works that are procured in both levels of government, there is a need to cure this issue of late payment. And I think that to that end, it is a very well-meaning bill. But sometimes these well-meaning bills can also come with some challenges that I think that in the case of this particular bill does indeed outweigh the benefit that we might have. And I say so because, number one, reason why it will be difficult for me to support this bill is because when we look at the issues like payment in counties, and we have seen this time without number, availability of funds is a very major component of how payments are done to contractors, to people who are offering services. And Madam Speaker, this availability of funds is a function of the exchequer, which goes with revenue collections. We know that even as we speak right now, Madam Speaker, we have struggled as a house, and I sit in Budget and Finance. I also sit in CPIC, where we try to hold the Treasury, the National Treasury, accountable as much as we can. And sometimes you find pressures that are indeed impossible to deal with, where the National Treasury has had serious exchequer demands, yet they have not received serious exchequer receipts, to the extent that balancing that out becomes a very difficult sense. So for instance, right now, we do know that counties do have money that has not been given to counties since March, April, May, and we are going to the next year. In such a case, availability of funds is a problem. So then if you put a punitive bill on people who do not have control of this, it becomes a problem. Secondly, Madam Speaker, this bill proposes interest rates to be increased on pending bills. For these suppliers. You see, for every action, there is a reaction. When you impose something like interest rates on bills that have not been paid, you actually also increase bills for that particular government entity or procurement entity. So for instance, if a particular entity owes a particular service provider X, and then you impose that interest rate on them for that late payment, which sometimes is out of their control for reasons that I've explained, like availability of funds, then it means that that particular interest becomes another pending bill. And that is something that we must seriously consider. And the moment you've also brought about expansive levels of interest in things like pending payments, the bill ought to have actually thought about how do you fund that interest, one. And number two, the bill should also have thought about how then do you report on that interest? Because when you look at how interests are done, definitely you'll want the same accounting officers that you're trying to keep or hold accountable at the end of every financial year to do a different report on the interest rates. Do they do this report to CBK, or do they do this report to National Treasury? This makes it problematic. And further, if you were to be more adventurous in strict financial terms, you will also go and look at, do you want these interests to be compounded, or are they going to be simple interest? And then, Madam Speaker, then things just becomes complicated when you think about expanding that interest issue. So that makes it very difficult for me to support the bill. And Madam Speaker, additionally, if you're going to impose something like interest on payments that counties or even national government is not doing because of other issues like delay of funds, then it goes without saying that you must put an equal equation to the other side, whereby if there is an accelerated payment to a particular service provider, then does it mean that that service provider then has to discount the county or the national entity? That must be considered in the interest of including the kind of interests that are proposed by this bill. Madam Speaker, I also think that proposed penalties under offenses in the clause, I think 7 by the bill to the accounting officers is a little bit exorbitant, Madam Speaker. And this is because of the reason that I said. If the exchequer does not guarantee that there will be availability of funds, then it goes without saying that any accounting officer also will not have control on the availability of that fund. So then how do you account for that lack of control of a procurement entity where the officer does not have control on that availability? Then you punish them based on timelines and not based on availability of funds. That becomes extremely problematic. And we have seen it even if you look at the County Government Act, whereby both the PFM and the County Government Act in the level of counties does establish what we call the county treasury. And in the county treasury, the head of that treasury is actually supposed to be the CEC finance. But when you look at our IFMIS system, Madam Speaker, today you will find that the IFMIS system, the way it is coded at the controller of budgets, we have somebody called approver 2, approver 1, and people approve in different levels. And it's not strictly exposed to the adherence of who then the accounting officer becomes there. So in a place where you have punished an accounting officer with a bill of 5 million or 5 years jail term, where it was completely out of their control, how then do you account for that kind of officer? Madam Speaker, I also think that it is critical that before, as a Senate, we think about passing this bill, we need to look at the progression between this bill and the Public Procurement and Asset Disposal Act of 2015, which was actually ratified and approved by this Parliament in 2020. Because I find a lot of what has been proposed by this bill as having been taken care of by the PPAD Act of 2015. And I just wanted to help Senator Mariam in looking at some of the classes that have come here. And I think that they're the most substantive classes. I didn't pick all of them, but the most substantive ones. So if you look at section 4 of this, on the prompt payment of accounts, the timelines within which payments have to be made to contractors is set at 60 days. And the period starts from the day of the receipt of the invoice. That's what this is proposing. Further, goods must be properly certified before payment. But this is actually addressed by Regulation 150 of the Public Procurement and Asset Disposal Act of 2020, exactly the same way. If you look at Section 5 of what is proposed here on priority of payment, this is also provided for in Regulation 139(1) and 6 of the Public Procurement and Asset Disposal Regulations 2020. If you also go to Section 7, which I had also referred to, on interest rates, that I've actually really spent time talking about, if you look at Section 140 of Public Procurement and Asset Disposal Act, it provides the same, but with a more scientific method on how do you deal with the questions of reporting, how do you deal with the question of computation, how do you deal with the questions of funding those interests. So it's already actually provided for. If you look at Section 9 of on offenses, which is what I think is becoming a motive from the House, because people are talking from the perspective of paying different service providers from an emotive perspective. Section 9 is actually a replica of Section 176A(c) of Public Procurement and Asset Disposal Act, which actually provides for penalty for delay in payment beyond contractual period. And Madam Speaker, this bill is also very innovative around looking at the invoicing system, which I think is a very good idea, as captured in Section 6 on the return on invoice. But this one could also be well addressed under the contractual agreement between the supplier and the procurement entity under dispute mechanism that's already provided for under Public Procurement Assets and Disposal Act. And Madam Speaker, lastly, my attention was drawn to Section 8 on fair dealing, which I think is a valid issue. But on this fair dealing, actually, if you look at the Public Procurement Act, there's a proposal that this should be, actually there's not a proposal but a regulation that this should, that contract should be provided on the contract obligations of each party, so that each party is held accountable. While it is a motive that these different service providers must be paid for their services, it is equally important that you equally hold them accountable. Which brings me to another point here, Madam Speaker, on why I think that the bill would have been more prolific if you had done segmentation of which kind of service providers are you talking about. Because a big contractor who is doing roads in our counties or who is working on SGR, for instance, does not need to be protected to the extent that they are paid 30 days. But if you're talking about SMEs or micro enterprises that you segmented on this particular bill, then you make it possible to have a conversation that is more segmented and more targeted in helping the businesses that are more at risk. And that way, then even the idea of bottom-up agenda is actually well taken care of. Madam Speaker, I also think that the bill, for it to have been more prolific, and perhaps this could be an amendment that I could propose, is if you had looked at the scope of the bill with regards to where is the bulk of the spending in government. Today we know, Madam Speaker, that in national government, about 63% of the spending goes to cost on the current budget that is mostly employees. And when you look at it from that perspective, when you go to counties, we also have about 70% of money that is spent in counties is about employees. What does this mean? This means that when you look at things like deductions, whereby you want to look at pension deductions or any other deductions that are due, and the bulk of pending bills that you're seeing in counties is actually employee deductions. For instance, we know that our lap trust as well as county pension fund are owed by counties up to 50 billion, Madam Speaker. If you cannot be able to address that with this kind of bill, because that's also a payment ticket. That is why we need to look at the scope of how do you expand this. Then the bill loses meaning, because then you will have more interest put on a small section of total spending of government vis-a-vis where you should actually be targeting, and where we are having more interest that are accrued outwards. Outwards here I mean, if we have got a pending bill like KRA deductions, and KRA is getting that money from counties in terms of fines and interest, and that is what we should be able to curb, because counties will pay for them later, as well as national government. That scope.
Order Senator Tobiko and Senator Seki.
That scope is what I would have really wanted to see in this bill dealt with. And lastly, Madam Speaker, I think that because it's a bill that looks entirely on general payments, I think that there is a concept of exemption whereby some spending can be spending on operations and contingencies that you do not have control over. So for instance, right now, Madam Speaker, if you look at the crisis in the northern part of Kenya, where there's serious military spending that can sometimes require some immediate military procurement that has to be done, or even the Shakahola monies that I just came from in Kilifi, where you need a serious intervention and a serious spending right there, and sometimes contractual drawings of those natures might take a whole different turn based on emergency basis. How then do you punish accounting officers based on blatant reasoning around timelines and pure delays of funds? So if these are the issues that could have been captured in the bill, I think that it then would have been a more holistic bill. But in the current format, I think that we run the danger of a serious replication of the PPAD Act of 2015, approved in 2020. And therefore, Madam Speaker, I oppose this bill, not out of any utter disrespect for the kind of intellect and work that my sister Senator Mariam has put into this bill, but purely because some of these proposals have got overreaching effect in terms of how effective and how efficient our counties can be in terms of managing this kind of procurement processes. I thank you, Madam Speaker.
Senator Nyamu, sorry.